I'm really delighted to be here. I miss New York. I lived in Ithaca for a couple of years when I was science editor at Cornell. And I was asked to talk about the evolution of field guides. And I'm going to start way, way back when people were just drawing birds on rocks. The oldest known illustration of a bird was made about 32,000 years ago of an owl. And this is another owl. This also was in France about 22,000 BC, so about 24,000 years ago. I don't know, this one wasn't dated, a petroglyph in Alaska, but it's thousands of years old. And some of them are not as old as people thought because some people in the 1700s actually observed native people drawing on the rocks. So some of it is only a few hundred years old, but it's all pretty interesting. And different places, people have different birds and they draw different pictures of them. But that lasted for a while. But then people started painting dead birds. And it started with people in America. It started with Mark Catesby, I think was probably the first. In 1729, he first published his Natural History of Carolina, Florida, and the Bahama Islands. And he did all these plates. And now we look at the pictures as pretty primitive, but it was kind of advanced compared to that. And Alexander Wilson, the father of American ornithology, published the first edition of his American ornithology book in 1808. John James Audubon came along. He loved having his portrait done holding his gun because every bird he painted was based on the dead bird that he had shot. And then he usually ate them too. So his journals have all kinds of information about how birds tasted as well as what they looked like and what they sounded like. It's There are a few complete copies laying around, and the University of Pittsburgh has an amazing resource where they have digitized all the paintings and you can download them, and they're glorious. This is my absolute favorite Audubon painting. This is an extinct species, the Carolina parakeet, but I love it because even though he had to shoot these birds, um, look how he noticed, how they noticed him. I love the whole sense that bottom one looking directly at him is just remarkable. So I have a copy of this in my bedroom. And I have a print of this in my living room because the pileated is one of my absolute favorite birds. And he did a really beautiful job with them. But then we got to field guides. You can't lug around Audubon's book when you're out in the field. And the very first field guide was actually written by Florence Marion Bailey in 1889, Birds Through an Opera Glass. She wanted to help people figure out birds who were not going to shoot them. So this was she was a woman way ahead of her time because to see all the details, you really did need birds in the hand. And it's only been during my time as a birder that some states started allowing additions to the state list that were based on a specimen. The very first one of, most states have a collection of all the birds, of all the species ever reported in the state. But she wanted to change things so people could identify birds without having to kill them first. And so that was a big innovation. And it had nice pictures, but most people back then still based their field guide drawings on specimens. So they were still lugging around their shotgun. Frank Chapman wrote his Handbook of Birds. The first edition came out in 1895. That one got a lot of praise from the American Ornithologists Union. It really did make it much, much easier for uh, bird watchers as well as people shooting birds to identify them. His drawings were really, really good for it all being black and white, and he really had details about different plumages and stuff. It was wonderful. Now, some of you guys may know about this field guide. It's not usually listed when people are talking about the evolution of field guides, but Ralph Hoffman's was specifically about Eastern New York and New England. And this came out in 1904. And his drawings and his full page plates were by Louis Agassiz Fuertes, and they're absolutely beautiful. He was one of the wonderful artists who's very tightly um, uh, embedded with Cornell. The drawings, they changed a lot of the bird names, and the digitized copy I got in Google, I'm not sure about the actual, I don't have a copy of the actual book, but it shows white-breasted nuthatch for all the page headings, but it calls it the white-bellied nuthatch and the red-bellied nuthatch on the illustrations and on the in the text itself. So I love Louis Agassiz Fuertes' illustrations. These showed the differences between what we now call the loggerhead shrike and the northern shrike really clearly. And up here in Minnesota, we're starting occasionally to get records of loggerhead shrikes again. We've never had them in northern Minnesota, but every now and then they're appearing now, and also in Wisconsin. And a nice straightforward illustration showing that eye line is really useful. Louis Agassiz Fuertes did this one too. Chester Reed came out with his bird guide, and it was an innovation because a lot of it was in color in 1909. But it and it was really pretty, but it was still fairly primitive. The printing on the copy I had was good, but a lot of the printing back then, there would be a slight shift between when they put one color on and when they put the next color on. So there'd be a bit of a blur that makes it look really old. And you can actually see that a little bit on the tree sparrow. The Red Book, the Green Book, and the Blue Book of Birds of America came out in 1931. Most of the birds have one page, a few have two pages, but each bird is illustrated with just a single drawing, usually of the male. And so this would be worthless in New York or Minnesota in wintertime when no goldfinches look like that. Then Roger Tory Peterson came along, and his first field guide came out in 1935. All my dates are for the very first publication of these works, and I hope I'm accurate. Peterson was very innovative, but he also borrowed a whole lot of the concept of his book from Ernest Thompson Seton's Two Little Savages. And you could look directly and compare the illustrations in Seton's 1903 book to the Peterson illustrations in his original field guide. But Peterson did have one innovation that nobody had thought of, and that was the little lines to the field marks. And that was an extremely useful thing. In his books, for the longest time, the plates were entirely separate from the information about each bird. So you'd have to go back and forth between the picture and the plate. And in his first edition, he didn't have the page numbers that you would even refer to get more information. You'd have to look it up in the index. But his guides evolved through his lifetime. His artwork became more precise and vivid, more lifelike, but he kept those trademark little lines pointing to everything. In 1946, Richard Poe wrote the Audubon Land Bird Guide, and a couple of years later, he came out with the Water Bird Guide. And these had more plumages than Peterson showed. They still were fairly patternistic. Some of them were in more lifelike poses than many of Peterson's birds, but he had a very dull, boring background. You didn't, very generic. You don't get a sense of the bird's habitat or anything. But he had the most information you could get about a bird. And so when I started birding, I had the Peterson guide, the Golden Guide, I'll show you next, but then also this guide, which gave a lot of valuable information about the bird's habits. And the Water Bird Guide came out in 51. But then Chandler Robbins, my hero, um, uh, I wrote a very long piece about him on my blog. And so both two different writers from the Washington Post called me after he died for their obituary. He's the one who banded Wisdom, the albatross on Midway Island, who's the only known bird in the known universe, the only known wild bird who is older than me. Wisdom was banded in 1956, and so she couldn't have hatched later than winter at the beginning of 1951, and I was born at the end of 1951, so Wisdom must be older than me. But he banded her, and he wrote. Look at these binoculars of his. This picture was probably from the 60s or maybe the early 70s. These are the exact same binoculars, and I'm not making that up. He got these old beat up, I think they were Bushnells. He loved them, and people kept plying him with binoculars and other gifts, and he just kept donating them to people who couldn't afford binoculars down in the tropics where our birds winter. And he said, he didn't need fancy binoculars. Those worked just fine. Those were the binoculars he was using. I took this picture at lunch when he went to the bathroom. But Golden asked him to write this field guide. He said, no way. We already have the Peterson guide and the Audubon Land Bird Guide. We don't need this. And they kept begging him. And he finally agreed to do it, but they had to meet certain of his requirements. And one of them was including the sonograms of the birds. And if you could see on the far left, each bird has a little a frequency graph of their a song. And I remember when I started out birding and was meeting some of the top birders, them panning that from the Golden Guide. They thought it was a waste of space. Nobody understands it. It's worthless. But I'll get to that in a little while. When I did my big year back in 2013, I ended up being a lower 48 big year. But one of my goals was to see every single bird on this page spread except Bachman's warbler, which is extinct, but including Brewster's warbler, which isn't even a species. It's a hybrid between the golden and the blue-winged warblers. And I did succeed in that, so I was very happy. Singer's drawings were so much more vivid. He made them all look alive, and he put them in the kind of vegetation that you would see the bird in. So he was, without even wasting the space to talk too much about habitat, he was giving you a vivid sense of habitat. And these two-page spreads comparing some of the groups of birds, the gulls, the warblers, the hawks, were very, very useful for me when I started birding. My mother-in-law, my first field guide was the Peterson guide that my mother-in-law gave me for Christmas, 1974. I read it cover to cover, did not feel qualified to be a birder. I bought the Golden Guide, read that cover to cover, then checked out Roger Tory Peterson's guide, not Roger Tory Peterson, Joe Hickey, he was Peterson's friend, a guide to bird watching. And then on March 2nd, 1975, so it took me 2.5 months, I finally felt qualified to go on campus and look for my first bird. I tucked away my brand new Christmas binoculars until I went out on March 2nd, and the first bird I beheld was a black-capped chickadee. And that was 50 years ago this month. But the Golden Guide has only been revised once, and they didn't make a very serious revision. It was there were very few, if any, new illustrations. They updated the names and some of the information, and the range of the house finch had changed mightily from just a little teeny. It was, I don't even think in the first edition it was a spot in New York, but the revised one had them spreading out a little bit. In 1983, National Geographic pretty much decided to put the very best of the Golden Guide and the very best of the Peterson Guide into one guide, the National Geographic Guide. I actually have every one of the editions. So it had the maps and the information facing the bird. Peterson's revision, it took till then, till around 1980 for him to do that. And he never did put the maps facing the birds. When he started including maps, they were in the back of the book. But this had a lot of information, more plumages than the Golden Guide showed. And for some species, it showed more background hinting to the habitat. But 1997, the American Birding Conservancy, the American Bird Conservancy came out with this field guide, which hardly anybody heard of, but it was really lovely. It was a premium when you joined ABA back then, and they tried to put the birds in the habitat. They really focused on that. And they didn't have a whole lot about identifying them. And the field guide never really caught on, but I always thought it was a charming book that I love having. Sibley came out with his guide in 2000, and this was a passion project. It took him many years to write it and draw it. And he had not just the plumages of the birds perched, but for every bird, he showed them in flight. He had really good range maps. He was very focused on identification, so you don't get a lot about behavior. But there are so many people who swear by this book. He used the little lines that Peterson had used too. And his guide, the Eastern and Western, were just taken from the original. And then he came up with the new edition, which is even cooler. The pictures are bigger, but the first printing of it was very difficult for older people to read, or people with any visual issues, because the writing was too small and too pale. It wasn't black. And so they had to reprint it immediately and actually exchange it for people who did not like, who couldn't read it. Kaufman came out with his guide the same year, and his big innovation was using photographs instead of illustrations. Now, I left out Audubon's first photographic guide because I hate it, and because all the pictures are just cut out pictures. What Kaufman did that was innovative was to pull the bird out of the background, and he was very meticulous in Photoshop in adjusting the colors so they were as true as a good artist's paintings of the birds. And this was the guide my children loved. People who started growing up in the 80s grew up with books that had lots of photos of natural things. And this is the one they liked. But notice he used the little lines pointing to the things, to the important field marks too. So Kaufman's has been the guide when people want to buy a field guide for young adults or children. This is the one I always recommend if they want one that shows the whole country because of its photos, only it has a few of the flaws of what I consider the flaws of photographic field guide. And like I said, it has those little lines pointing to the critical field marks. Stokes's came out with their field guide in 2010, and this has the just squared photos. And for some reason, um, I never warmed up to photographic guides like this. But again, my kids loved it. So it's a lot of it is a matter of taste. What I've always told people when they ask me what field guide to buy, I tell them go to pick out 5 birds that you really know. Go to the bookstore, thumb through the books, the ones that you seem the best to you, look up those 5 birds and see which ones show the birds the best for the way you see the bird. Because it's very personal what field guide you choose. Crosley's guide drives me insane, but oh gosh, my kids loved this guide. He just pulls every picture he could find of that bird and throws it all on one page. And what drives me a little crazy is some of them, the cedar waxwing guy, I think this is a really well done page, but some of the pages, his some of his pictures aren't as well focused as others. And the way he sets them up and sizes them, it would make my eyes feel like I was all screwed up because some of them would, I would think were supposed to be in the background when they were further forward, or the sizes weren't perfectly calibrated for the distance they were supposedly away from the front of the scene. And it drives me crazy. But so many people love this guide for showing so much of cedar waxwings on one page, and it is cool. Some of the pages work better than others. I'm not exactly sure. I have never, ever seen that many tree sparrows in that kind of a scene, but I live in northern Minnesota, so I never see that kind of a scene anyway. Then, now the Warbler Guide, there are a lot of field guides that are just for one group of birds, gulls. There's a great gull guide that just came out, but I think the Warbler Guide is my favorite of these single family treatments. It has 560 pages for one family of birds. There's 137 pages of introductory matter that's really useful. Only 56 species are covered, and the species accounts cover 374 pages. So they average more than 8 pages per species of warbler. And I'll go through. At the beginning, one of the things he has is the East and the West spring and fall quick finders, and he has them so you can download them and print them out to bring with you in the field without having to lug the whole 560-page book. And they're quite useful. But the Blackburnian warbler, here's all the pages. He shows dead ones to show the range of features in one picture. He has beautiful photos of live ones, and just so much information. And then aging and sexing, comparing it with other species that might be confused with it. And he's got these guys really upped the game for providing sonograms and field guides. Nobody else had done that. It's not just these two pages. Yeah, I guess it is just that 2 pages for them. But then has other plumages and comparison species. It's just such a resource. And he has a whole section at the beginning. I think it's 8 pages, just how to read the sonograms and how to listen to the warbler songs. So that is a maximalist field guide for one small group. Then we have ABA came up with their um, field guides to particular states. New York was not the first, but it was among the first. The very first ones came out in 2014 for New Jersey, Colorado, and Florida. New York's came out in 2016 by Corey Finger. All of them use Brian Small's photographs for the most part. And I wrote the field guide to the birds of Minnesota in 2016. Now, it drove me a little crazy when they asked me to write it. They wanted me to limit it to 240 species. And I said no, because it leaves out too many. We have birders in Minnesota who have seen 400 species in the state. So that did not seem like enough. And I did not want to do it, but I think they really, I was the first woman to write one of these, and I think they really wanted a woman to write one of them because people were complaining. So they kept coming back, and finally they agreed to put at least 300 species in. And so I went ahead and wrote it. But now here, compare this to the Blackburnian, the 8-page treatment in the Warbler Guide. We have 1 page for Blackburnian and only 2 pictures. And there's a description of their song, but no kind of sonogram or anything. But now field guides have changed. I talked to so many people who started birding during the pandemic, have never, ever even considered buying a field guide because they use Merlin. Now they can use their phone to identify birds. It started with eBird in 2002, and at the beginning, it was just to identify pictures of birds. And it took them a while to tweak it so that, I have put in pictures of yellow-bellied flycatcher that is a pretty bad picture, but eBird, Merlin's figured it out, but eBird is a listing program. I'm sorry, I'm getting eBird and Merlin confused. But this is for listing, but people could use it as a field guide now on a smartphone. They couldn't when they had to go to the home to check their computer, but they have a whole lot of identification stuff in eBird, and they have their listen feature where if you click on listen, you can play various songs and see the sonograms of them as the song is going through. So if you're having trouble reading sonograms, this is an excellent resource for figuring out what the sounds are like because they race through that line and you know exactly which part sounds like what. But Merlin came out as kind of an extension of eBird in 2014. During the time I was at the lab, they were doing a lot of tweaking to eBird, and they were starting getting Merlin running. And now all you need is your smartphone, and Merlin will tell you what the birds are. And it would get an A by the old standard when I went to school, where if you got a 93% on a final, you got an A um, before they graded on a curve. Merlin has a really good accuracy in places where there's a lot of birders who have fed into their database of sounds. But twice last year, Merlin told me there was a Philadelphia vireo that I tracked down to find it was a red-eyed vireo. But the whole reason they sound so much alike is actually to trick each other too. So So if they can trick each other, they can trick Merlin. But overall, Merlin's incredibly accurate, both for identifying your pictures of birds and the sounds of birds. And a lot of people my age are very resistant to that in exactly the way that ornithologists my age felt in the 70s and 80s when people wanted to add a new bird to the state list with only their description or a photograph, that when they needed to have that specimen to be sure. At every step of the uh, as we go along, people think that the new people are doing it all wrong. They're not as well disciplined as we were. But I've run into a lot of young birders who use Merlin who are amazingly skillful. So it's what you put into it as an individual. But this is the field guide of the future. So the evolution of field guides, this is just the visual part. There's writing on the wall, and then books, and now digital. And we don't know how long that will last. But I wanted to touch a little bit on bird songs and how they have changed over the years. There was rudimentary descriptions of the bird songs. Audubon talked about what they sounded like. Some birds are actually named onomatopoeic for their sound, like chickadees. And so people have been aware of bird sounds and using words to describe them for a long time. F. Schuyler Matthews wrote the Field Book of Wild Birds and Their Music in 1904, and he used musical notation for songs. Aretha Saunders wrote A Guide to Bird Songs in 1935, and he was using these are close to sonograms that he was just drawing by hand. And like I said, the Golden Guide, it used sonograms right in the pages. And then now these are so in vogue. Merlin shows the sonograms and eBird does. So it's been a really big innovation.